Mr. President, one of my extraordinary friends in Chicago is Dr. Salul. Dr. Salul is a Syrian-American. He's an exceptional man. His wife, Suzanne, is also an extraordinary person. He has created an organization called Med Global. The best way to summarize what it does is to think of Doctors Without Frontiers and how they travel across the world and go to some of the most dangerous places and volunteer medical assistance. Dr. Salul, through Med Global, has done the same thing. Many of the doctors that volunteer for Med Global are Muslim and from the Middle East themselves, but they can be found on any spot in the world. He calls me from places. I've run into him in places and seen him, and I just can't believe what this man does. He risks his life to go to war zones and treat people who have been injured. I think so highly of him. He has a friend in Gaza, a doctor who was highlighted in the New York Times several days ago, Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, director of the pediatric ward at Kamal Adwan Hospital. Many of the casualties from the Jabaliyah strikes were taken to that hospital. I read this article and I've reread it many times. Try to understand what is happening on the ground in Gaza. Let me start at the beginning. What the terrorist group Hamas did to Israel was an atrocity. The attack on October 7th cannot be rationalized, explained, or for that matter forgiven for what they did to the innocent victims in Israel. And the fact that Israel is defending itself is perfectly right in my eyes. They have a right to do that. And of course, Hamas continues to be a terrorist threat to them, and to try to stop Hamas in this activity is understood. At the same time, it's important that they accept the standards which civilized nations accept, even in the conduct of warfare. That's the message that's been delivered by President Biden and again by Anthony Blinken, our Secretary of State, over and over. To be careful that your ultimate reaction is consistent with the threat and hews to the basic standards of civilization. That has been the request over and over again. The reason I come to the floor is because I got a call this morning from Dr. Salul, and he spoke this morning to Dr. Hussam again about the situation at this hospital. What the doctor had to say is basically what was in the article in the New York Times, which I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record at this moment.
Without objection.
Here is a situation reported from the hospital in Gaza. They will be out of fuel and electricity in 24 hours. Dr. Hussam told Dr. Salul, at this point, 5 children will die. The ventilators that are keeping them alive will be turned off. They cannot be transported to a better or safer place. Turning off the electricity in some areas of the hospital will cause great hardship and pain. There's no fuel at the other hospitals either. In the north, they've basically been cut off from any assistance. It's impossible to transfer to the south because they don't have transportation and they don't have the wherewithal, the ambulances and such to do so. The desperate situation that they've reached includes performing amputations with no anesthesia. Performing amputations with no anesthesia. I asked Dr. Salul, what do they use? He said, Tylenol. Can you imagine? Tylenol. They use vinegar because they don't have any access to iodine to clean the wounds before there's operation. Vinegar. Every day, 200 people show up at their hospital sick from the contaminated water which they're forced to drink. They're begging for help. They're asking for a pause so that basics can be provided. Food, electricity, fuel, medicines, the basics. I don't think that's an unreasonable request. And I'm sorry that they have been turned down in their efforts to get this kind of help. There are 150 patients in this hospital, twice the number as usual. Many are sleeping on the floor, and surgeries are performed on the floor. I read this article, Mr. President, last Friday and kept a copy of it, and now I've entered it into the record for others to read as well. At one point, Dr. Abu Safaya said, "We wish for death. It is easier than seeing the horrific scenes we're witnessing." Twice now, this refugee camp Jabalia, has been attacked by the Israelis as a site of Hamas terrorism. Unfortunately, the first day of the attack, 40 people did not survive and 250 others were brought to the hospital. And then the attack took a second day with basically the same results. The doctor said, "I've never in my life seen injuries this bad," adding, "We saw children decapitated as a result of these attacks." Asking for a pause in the war for the purpose of humanitarian relief is not unreasonable. It is humane and civilized. The United States is begging both sides to take that step. I would join in that effort. I hope that this ends well and soon. But in the meantime, these innocent, helpless victims need to have a helping hand from the rest of the world. We need to provide the basics so that they can survive. I will do my best to follow this closely. I encourage the United States to continue its efforts to ask for this pause in the action for relief of the victims. This sort of situation in any part of the world cannot be ignored. Mr. President, now you yield the floor.